Okay, 1 o'clock, and we're ready for another of our meetings to talk about Aesop's fables. I hope you all had a good weekend. Give me a wave if you can hear me okay, so I know that audio is working. Good. So if you can't hear me, there's a problem on your side, which you should figure out, but everything seems to be working well. This is our third or fourth meeting. I'm not sure, but the topic for today, there's an interesting fable in Aesop, and the title of it is The Power of Fables, and it's actually a lesson about fables. So an interesting lesson for today that we'll go over, and we'll take our time, read through it, then talk about its meaning and all that. Let me just make sure everybody gets into the room before we start. All right, so let's see, any announcements I need to make? I'm going to be offering more live classes. So I just sent out an announcement. So either you or your parents should receive it by email. I'm actually going to offer a total of about 12 live classes. They're for different students, so it's not like you'd be expected to, attend all of them. Some will be for younger students, some will be for older students on all of the major subject areas. So there'll be a meeting for philosophy, a meeting for theology, one for Greek, one for history and geography. So there's a list of them that I'm going to offer. And I just sent an email to everyone. So if you would remind your parents later today, just to make sure they keep an eye out for that message about live classes. And then if you'd like to attend any other classes, you're all invited to do so, and it doesn't cost anything for you. So it's up to you and your parents if you'd like to do that or not. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. Let me just make sure everybody gets in. I see some new folks still showing up. Just a minute. Let me make sure everybody gets in. Okay. All right, so the chat box is open too, so you can chat anything you'd like to share with me as we go along, and we'll go back and forth a little bit as we go through the lesson. So this is an interesting lesson on, I still have people coming in, sorry. This is an interesting lesson about fables. So we're going to talk about fables a little bit. Is there anybody who would like to read the fable for us? I'll zoom in a little bit. Anyone who'd like to read? And if you struggle to read, if you can't read well, please don't volunteer. Let's get someone volunteer who's a strong reader. Let's see. Grace, I'll let you read here. Let me just open up your microphone 1 minute. Grace Allington. Let me just find you so I can unmute you.
Diomedes, a famous
There you
Greek.
go, Grace. Hold on, Grace. You can see that okay? Is it large enough for you?
Yeah.
Okay, so just take your time and read nice and clearly, all right?
Diomedes, a famous Greek orator, was once addressing an assembly at Athens on a subject of great importance, and in vain tried to fix the attention of his hearers. They laughed among themselves, watched the sports of the children, and went in 20 other ways showed they wanted of concern in the subject of discourse. Diomedes, after a short pause, spoke as follows. Ceres, on one day, journeyed in company with Swallow and Neil. At this there was marked attention and every ear strained now to catch the words of the orator. The party came to a river, continued he. Neil swam across. The Swallow flew over. Then he resumed the subject of his harangue. A great cry, however, rose from the people. And Ceres, they cried. What did Ceres do? Why, the goddess was, and indeed he is now, he replied, mighty offend, but the people should have their ears open to any sorts of foolery and shut to words of truth and wisdom.
All right, thank you very much, Grace. So here we have a fable about fables, as I said. So we've got an interesting subject to go through, and let's get into the details of it. And remember, what I recommend that you do is, as we go over this fable, pay attention. You might even want to jot some notes down if you're following along. And then after this class is over, go and get this fable assignment finished and turned in so you can get credit for the class. And that's, I think, the easiest and fastest way for you to get through the Aesop's Fables course. So let's go through this together. So rather than a normal fable, we have a fable about fables, which is pretty interesting. A fable about fables. And we're going to talk a little bit about a subject that's known as rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of speaking in a way that's persuasive, or trying to speak as persuasively as possible. It's impossible to persuade anyone of anything because we have free will. So even if we make the best possible argument, even if we use the best arguments, the best illustrations, everything we say is true, people can still reject what we say because they can just choose not to accept it, not to do it. So it's impossible to persuade human beings of anything because they have free will. But when we do communicate, it's our job to try to communicate as persuasively as we can. And we saw a good example of this in the last fable where we talked about the ape and the fox, where the fox thought that he was so smart, but he didn't persuade the voters and lost the election. So sometimes we may have the best message, what we think is the best message, but it's not the best message for the audience that we're talking to. When I'm talking to children, I talk very differently than when I'm talking to adults. When I talk to my friends, I talk very differently than when I'm talking to my enemies. So we have to change the message and how we speak, how we write, when the audience changes to whom we speak or write. So we learned a good example of that in the last fable on the ape and the fox. And now we have this story of this man named Demades, who was a famous Greek orator. And an orator, if you don't know what an orator is a public speaker, a person who speaks to large audiences, all right? A famous Greek orator. And in the ancient world, it's sort of, you know, in our life today is very different because we do things very differently. We have radio, television, the internet, and so on. So for example, if you start a business and you want to get the message of your business out, you're not going to find an orator to represent your business and speak to the crowd. What you're going to do is you're going to hire someone who makes advertisements, an advertising agency or a marketing agency. There are different professionals who do these things in modern ways. They make ads for television, ads for the radio, they make, you know, websites and advertisements for the internet. So we have lots of different ways of getting our message out and finding people to represent us when we need to share something. In the ancient world, there was no electricity, no radio, no television, no internet. There was no printing press. You didn't have a computer at home where you could print out a poster or anything like that. And so if you wanted to get a message out, you had to find someone who could speak to a crowd, who could get a crowd's attention and then speak in an attractive way to that crowd of people. And so the orator was a public speaker, and men, you know, influential people would hire orators to speak for them to the public. And so there were men who studied rhetoric and the art of public speaking, and they would be paid to speak to audiences. A good example of this in modern times would be a lawyer. If something happens and you need to go to court, or your parents need to go to court for something, they usually won't speak for themselves. They'll hire someone, a lawyer or attorney, to speak for them. And that person is an expert in the law. He understands how the courts works. He knows what to say and what not to say. He's very careful with his words. And so we'll hire a lawyer to speak for us to the court. That's what an orator was like in the ancient world, but they were used in many other ways, not just in courts. A good example of a lawyer, of an orator that will study in classical studies is Cicero. The Roman Cicero, we study his works in Latin reading too. He was a famous orator. So he would represent people publicly as a speaker, as a great speaker. So that's what this man Demades is. He is an orator. So he is a great, influential, powerful speaker who would be hired by people to speak to audiences, to speak to crowds of all different kinds. So he was a famous Greek orator, and he was addressing an assembly. That means a crowd of people. So he was speaking to a crowd in the city of Athens, which was the capital city of the Greek world. And he was speaking on a subject of great importance. So keep all of those things in mind. He was a great orator, a famous orator. He wasn't some boring, stinky speaker that no one wanted to listen to. He was a great, famous speaker. So he wasn't the problem. He was speaking in a great place. He was speaking in Athens, a beautiful, glorious city in the ancient world. And he was speaking on a subject of great importance. So he wasn't speaking on some boring topic that nobody cared about. The topic was of great importance. However, it says, in vain, he tried to fix the attention of his hearers. He couldn't get their attention. And here's why. They laughed among themselves. They were fooling around. They laughed among themselves. They watched the sports of the children. That means they paid attention to the kids fooling around. And in 20 other ways, they showed their want or lack of concern in the subject of the discourse or the speech that Demades was making. So Demades, a famous speaker, is trying to talk to this crowd, and they're not paying attention. He's not the problem. The subject is not the problem. The place is not the problem. They are the problem. And so what does he do? He decides to change the way that he speaks. And this is the art of rhetoric. He chooses to change the way he talks to this audience. It says, Demades, after a short pause, spoke as follows. And he starts to tell the crowd this story. He says, Ceres, which is one of the ancient goddesses, Ceres one day journeyed in company with a swallow and an eel. So he starts to speak to them as if he's going to tell them a fable. Ceres journeyed with a swallow, which is a small bird, and an eel, which is a fish that's sort of like a snake and a fish joined together. A swallow and an eel. Aesop then says, at this, when he started to tell them this story about the swallow and the eel, there was marked attention. So all of a sudden they started to pay attention. And every ear strained now to catch the words of the orator. All of a sudden, everyone was interested because he started to tell this story. 1 minute, more students coming in. So he started to tell this story. Every ear strained to hear him. The party, or the group, came to a river, continued he. The eel swam across the river, and the swallow flew over the river. He then resumed the subject of his harangue, and a harangue is the speech that he was given. It's sort of a serious, intense speech. So he started to tell this story about the swallow and the eel, told them this silly little detail, like, oh yeah, and then they got to the river, and you know what happened when they got to the river? The eel swam across. I guess the eel was like walking along the road and then decided to swim. Eels live in the water. They can't come out of water. So the eel swam across and the bird flew across. How boring can you get? No duh. That's what birds and eels do. So the story was just nonsense. Demades was telling them a story that was just silly nonsense, and he did it on purpose. And then after he got to that point, he went back to his regular speech. He resumed the subject of his harangue. A great cry arose from the people. And Ceres, cried they. What did Ceres do? After the eel swam across the river and the bird flew across, they're caught up in the story. They want to know, okay, yeah, what happened next? What happened next? But Demades was just setting them up. There's no real story. He wasn't about to tell them any story of Ceres, an eel, and a swallow. He says, the goddess was, this is his answer to them when they ask him for what happens next. He says, the goddess was, and indeed is now, mightily offended that people should have their ears open to any sort of foolery or foolishness and shut to the words of truth and wisdom. So that's this lesson here. And what Demades did was he chose to yell at them or rebuke them for acting foolishly and not paying attention to an important subject. And the way that he did it was he set them up to embarrass them by starting to tell some foolish story. And then when they got all into the story and started paying attention, they wanted to know the rest of the details. And he said, the goddess said that you're all foolish because you don't pay attention to important things, but you'll pay attention to some silly story. So he uses this fake fable that he really doesn't tell to teach the people a lesson, to show them that they're willing to pay attention when he talks about some childish thing. But if he talks to them as adults seriously, they don't pay attention. And so he was yelling at them to correct them as the speaker. So we see here a good example of the use of the art of rhetoric. He's starting to give his message, what he wants to say to the people. He notices that they're not the kind of people he expected. He expected them to come as adults and be mature and responsible. But as he looks at the crowd, he sees that they're silly people. And so what he decides to do then is change his message in order to correct them and get their attention so that he can then finish his speech. He wants to make them feel guilty that they're not paying attention so that when he starts again, they're ready to listen and get their act together and stop fooling around. So this lesson here, what I want you to see is a good lesson in the art of rhetoric. Okay, it shows you how a good speaker speaks to his audience, considers his audience and how they're responding, changes his message in order to accomplish his goal, and then goes ahead and finishes with his speech and accomplishes what he hoped to accomplish. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone changed. They could have still been acting foolish, but at least now they know that that they are acting foolish. And what's always important is that there are, sometimes when a teacher or someone talks to a crowd and, yells at a crowd or corrects a crowd, not everyone will change, but the people who are sort of good and just need some help, they're the ones who will change. And that's usually who correction is directed towards. If there's a foolish person, there's nothing you can do to make a foolish person stop acting foolish if they want to. But usually there are people who are maybe acting foolish because of the foolish person, but they really don't want to. And if they get yelled at, they get their act together and pay attention and do what's right. So the speaker uses his understanding of public speaking to take a break from his speech, correct the people, get their attention, and then finish his speech. And he uses a fable to do so. So that's the lesson. Now, what's interesting here is here we are studying Aesop's fables. We're reading all these fables. We just read the fable of the fox and the ape. We've read fables of two frogs walking. We've read fables of a camel who complained that he didn't have claws and fangs. We've read fables, all these different fables. And we know that they're sort of silly stories, right? None of them are realistic. They're silly. And yet here in this story, in this lesson, Aesop is actually criticizing people who pay attention to a fable, right? He's criticizing people who pay attention to a fable. Why? Well, because we shouldn't need to pay attention to fables. We shouldn't need someone to teach us fables. We should be able to read more serious writings. We should be able to study sacred scripture and learn these lessons. We should be able to study our catechism and learn these lessons. We should be able to study philosophy like Aristotle's Ethics and learn these lessons. But you know that it's hard to read those lessons. It's hard to watch the news sometimes or serious videos about important subjects. Even if the speakers are famous speakers, it's hard to pay attention to serious stuff because we get bored and we just want to be lazy or silly. And, we'd rather watch cartoons or something goofy, play a video game. That's a problem that we have. Fables are used as sort of a middle road. They're like a bridge. It allows a wise man to get the attention of silly people or immature people and get them to start thinking about important subjects, even when they're not willing to study them in a serious way. So we learn and understand what fables are. Fables are intended not for wise people, not for disciplined people, not for serious people. Fables are intended to help people become serious, to help people become wise, to give them interesting stories that are entertaining, that are like cartoons, but to teach a lesson that afterwards might leave them feeling guilty for how they behave and get their lives together and begin to be more virtuous. So we learn in this lesson what the purpose of fables are. They get the attention of people who won't pay attention to more serious lessons. And you can judge yourself and ask if that's true of you. Are there serious lessons that you're supposed to be studying that you don't want to study, but then you find the fables fun and interesting? So you're paying lots of attention to fables and no attention to grammar or to mathematics or to history or to your Latin studies or something. So you can see how fables, being fun, get our attention, and they teach us important lessons, but they kind of assume that we're silly people who need to be taught with silly stories. So we shouldn't necessarily be proud of the fact that we love the fables. We should learn the lesson that they teach us and realize that at some point, we're going to have to grow up and get more serious and start studying the real stuff and not play around with fables all the time. But at the same time, they're very helpful. They can teach us important lessons. They're easy for us to remember and so on. So they are important and useful for us. Okay. So sometimes they're hard. What's difficult about the fables, like Lawrence just chatted and commented, I wouldn't call them fun. What's difficult are the assignments. I mean, reading the fables, they're fun and silly sometimes. The assignments that you have to complete, they may be a little more difficult because they ask you to think a little more seriously and do some work, which isn't much fun. But anyway, that's the purpose of fables. And we see how this orator, Demades, used the fable to get the people's attention. So let's think about another thing. Let's think about when Jesus comes into the world to teach people. Okay, when Jesus comes into the world to teach people, what does he do? Give me a yes or no here. Does Jesus teach the people in the same way that Thomas Aquinas taught people? Does Jesus teach people in the same way that Aristotle taught people? Yes or no? No, he doesn't. What does Jesus use to teach the people about religion? What does he use? He uses fables, right? We don't necessarily call them fables because he usually doesn't tell us stories about animals or things like that. They're usually about people. They seem a little more realistic. They're imaginative human stories, and that's what parables are. Okay, very good, parables. So Jesus teaches parables. He uses parables to teach people, and that reveals what he thinks about his audience. If Jesus is teaching us in parables, does he think that his audience is very serious about subjects that they should be subject about? Yes or no? No. He knows that if he talks to them in just straightforward language like a catechism, he knows that they won't pay attention. And so he tells these stories to get their attention, and the stories are often emotional and they have an effect on us. And that's Jesus. We see an example of Jesus, even though he's God, we see Jesus teach human way. He teaches us as if he studied the art of rhetoric himself and is like Demades, who can change his message to try to reach a different audience. So we see an example in Jesus of how the truth can be presented to people who don't want to hear it in a way that they may listen to. And we see him making an effort, a human effort, to try and persuade and communicate the truth with people. He doesn't just say whatever he wants and then walk away and say, oh, well, I taught them the truth. They either accept it or they don't. That's their business. Jesus doesn't give us an example of that attitude of speaking to others. We see him choosing to communicate in ways that will influence the people, and they influence us today. Most of our knowledge about Jesus's teaching is from his parables. And when we have writings like the writings of Thomas Aquinas or sacred scripture or other books and sources for study, we tend not to study them because we say that they're boring or they're difficult. But the reality is that they're just sober and mature. And if we're silly-minded people, we don't like to do that kind of study. We like to, do coloring books and play video games and read silly, easy books that are written at our grade level, so we don't have to see any new words or read any difficult sentences. And that's the kind of mental laziness and immaturity that we have to learn to get out of as students, okay? So we have this great lesson here of Demades trying to reach this audience, changing his message to show that they may act like they can't hear him or they're not interested, but if he tells some foolish story, all of a sudden they're all paying attention, and he proves them guilty of just being irresponsible and not paying attention. There's an important quote that I want to share with you. There's a famous saint. His name is Saint John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman. He lived in England. He was actually a leader of a Protestant church in England, and he converted to Catholicism. He was like the equivalent of a bishop in the church, in a Protestant church, and he converted to Catholicism. So it was a famous conversion. You can imagine how much of an influence that had on people. But he taught about education, and he talked about schools and learning and things, and he criticized students who like to read books a lot, but they don't study serious subjects. And this is what he said. Just listen to this. He said, in an age like this, in an age like the age that we live in, where books abound, there are tons and tons of books, libraries filled with books, bookstores, your house might be filled with books. He said, in an age like this, where books abound, where books are everywhere, it's easy for us to think that a love of reading is real study, but it's not. A love of reading is not real study, because think about it. Before television was invented, if people were silly, what do you think they did? What do you think that they would do? What did silly people do if they didn't have television or video games to play with, or silly shows and cartoons to watch? What do you think the silly people did? They read books. They read silly books. They read silly stories, and they tried to find books that we would consider, leisure reading or just fun books. Well, before television was invented, that's what people did who just wanted to be silly and waste time. And you could have a silly book sitting next to a serious book, like a math textbook or like a philosophy book or your Bible, and the silly person will take the silly book and read the silly book. And St. John Henry Newman warned that this love of reading, some people think that, oh, Tommy's so smart, he loves reading. Yeah, but what is Tommy reading? Is Tommy reading good stuff, serious books that help him to gain wisdom? Or is Tommy just reading silly stuff, right? There's nothing really good about just reading, but it's like watching television shows. You can go on TV. Let's relax with the chat, okay? Pay attention. Pay attention to what I'm saying. You can go on YouTube or the television and watch shows, but what kind of shows? There are different kinds of shows. You can watch a serious film about the history of the world wars or some other period of history, or you can just sit and watch cartoons all day long. So watching TV or watching videos can be good or it could be bad. Reading books could be good or it could be bad. Are you reading good books, studying, textbooks and lessons, or are you reading silly books? So St. John Henry Newman warned about silliness in studies. Now, today, one of the problems, because we have television and YouTube and video games, some people will say, well, watching videos is bad and reading books is good. But that's not really true, because you can read bad books and you can watch good videos. So it's not that simple. There are serious videos, just like there are serious books, and there are silly books, just like there are silly stories. And this lesson in Aesop's Fables challenges us to pay attention to more important subjects, right? And I know that many of you are young, so you're going to grow, you've got years to grow up, and you're not going to really understand the importance of all these things until you get older and you get more experience. But there's a difference between just silliness and silly studies or silly activities and more mature and sober and responsible activities and things like that. So we're challenged in this fable to ask ourselves whether we pay attention to important subjects or if we just pay attention to silly stuff. Okay, so I'm ready to get into more serious studies and so on. So that's our lesson for today. It's a little bit different than a normal lesson because it's not really a fable, but it is a story that teaches us a moral lesson, right? So hopefully that's clear and helpful for this lesson. But that's it for this lesson on the power of fables and what they do. What is the power of fables? They get people's attention, okay? Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I know my internet glitched for a minute there. We see the power of fables. Make sure you get this. This is the real point of this lesson, so listen carefully. The real point of this lesson, the title is The Power of Fables. And what is the power of fables? They get people's attention. That's the power of fables. They get people's attention. As a student, you shouldn't need someone to get your attention with fables and silly stories. Sometimes even, sometimes, let's say at church, the church may do some silly stuff, like sometimes they may have a vacation Bible school or something like that. And sometimes it just gets too silly, or you might think it's silly and you don't need, well, that's good, right? Because activities like that are intended for who? They're intended for the silly people, right? They're intended to help children be interested in things that they wouldn't be interested in if they offered a plain catechism class or something like that. So those sorts of things that people do in the church, understand what the purpose is. If you're a more mature, more sober, more serious student, you may think stuff like that is dumb because you don't necessarily need that. You don't need somebody to dress up and act like a clown to get you interested in religion, and that's good. But most of the people, they do need someone to get dressed up like a clown to make them pay attention to religion. And that's why people in the church will do that. It's not necessarily bad. It's just for a certain group of people. Okay, so we can understand that. That's what this lesson here on the power of fables is about. When we want to communicate to people, we have to consider who those people are. And when we think about who those people are, we can understand and think about how to communicate with them. Okay? Give me a yes or no. Is my video clear now, or is it still frozen? Yes, it's clear now. Okay, thank you. All right, so that's this lesson of the power of fables. Gianna, you asked about fable number 117. I'd be happy to do it. We've got a few minutes here. I'll do it real quick. Can you just tell me what the title of that fable is, what the name of it is? Because I can search for the name, but I don't have the numbers in this book that I have. What's the title of it? And those of you who are still here, just hang around. We'll go over another fable real quick, and maybe you can get that one done too. The Town Mouse and the Country Mouse. All right, give me 1 minute. I'll open it up here. I'll search for Country Mouse. All right, here we go. Town Mouse and Country Mouse. We're just going to squeeze this in real quick. So pay attention. And like I said, if you pay attention, I'll get through this in, I don't know, 10 minutes. And you can get this one done too if you want. The Town Mouse and the Country Mouse. I'll read it real fast. It's a longer one. Thanks, Gianni. You pick a long one to do here. All right, real quick. Listen up. A country mouse, a plain, sensible sort of fellow, was once visited by a former companion of his who lived in a neighboring city. The country mouse put before his friend some fine peas, some choice bacon, and a bit of rare old Stilton, whatever that is, I don't know. Probably not too important. And called upon him to eat heartily off the good cheer. So he gave him good food, gave him good country food. That's the point, all right? The city mouse, who's used to life in the city, nibbled a little here and there in a dainty manner, wondering at the pleasure his host took in such coarse and ordinary fare, such plain, rough food. Okay, so the city mouse sort of nibbled at it, checked it out, pushed the stuff around on his plate and said, oh, okay, that's interesting. This isn't what we eat in the city. In their after dinner chat, the town mouse, or the city mouse, said to the country mouse, really, my good friend, that you can keep in such spirits in this dismal, dead and alive kind of place surprises me altogether. You see here no life, no gaiety, no society, in short, but go on in a dull, humdrum sort of way from one year's end to another. Come now with me this very night and see with your own eyes what a life I lead in the city. The country mouse consented, he agreed, and as soon as it fell dark, off they started for the city, where they arrived just as a splendid supper given by the master of the house where our town friend lived was over, and the guests had departed. The city mouse soon got together a heap of dainties, or delicious fancy foods, on a corner of the handsome Turkey carpet. The country mouse, who had never even heard the names of half the meats set before him, was hesitating where he should begin, when the room door creaked, opened, and in entered a servant with a light. The companions ran off, the mice ran off, but everything soon being quiet again, they returned to their repast or their meal, when once more the door opened, and the son of the master of the house came in with a great bounce, followed by his little terrier, his little dog, who ran sniffing to the very spot where our friends had just been. The city mouse by that time was safe in his hole, which, by the way, he had not been thoughtful enough to show to his friend, who could find no better shelter than that afforded by a sofa or a couch, behind which he waited in fear and trembling until quietness was again restored. The city mouse then called upon him to resume his supper, but the country mouse said, no, no, I shall be off as fast as I can. I would rather have a crust with peace and quietness than all your fine things in the midst of such alarms and frights as these. So this is the fable of a country mouse and a city mouse. So what's the point of this story? The country mouse, he lives out in the country. And, I live in the country. I grew up in a city, but I live in a country now. Out in the country, it's quiet. Our neighbors are, far away down the road. We've got lots of land. It's peaceful and quiet. And if you like peaceful and quiet things, and if you have other things to do, like I want to study and teach. So I like having peace and quiet. Out in the country, I have what I desire. If someone visited me and spent a week at my house, they would be like the city mouse. They'd say, man, it's boring around here. There's nothing to do. You go outside and there's just grass. What am I supposed to do outside? There's no cars passing by. There's no museums. There's no entertainment. There's no restaurants or anything like that. Man, how do you live this boring life out in the country? And I say, well, it may be boring, but it's very peaceful. It's very safe. My children can go outside and play all day long. I don't have to worry about them getting hit by cars. I don't have to worry about anybody getting kidnapped. I don't have to worry about any crime. We don't have people breaking in our house. It's a very quiet, peaceful, safe place. So there are some things that we lack. And again, I grew up in a city, so I know what city life is like. We don't have the best restaurants. We can't go out to the theater and watch a show. We can't necessarily send our kids to a good school if we wanted to. We live out in the middle of nowhere, out in the country. And so we lack some things, but we also lack all the troubles of the city life, all the troubles. And so you have to weigh the good with the bad, the pros and the cons. It may be boring, but it's safe. There may not be much to do out in town, but you can work and study without any distractions. And if that's what you like to do, you can do it in peace and quiet. And we may not have the best food. I know when I was growing up living in New Jersey, the food that we ate was much better, much more delicious than the food that we eat now in North Carolina. We don't have New Jersey pizza. We don't have good bagels. We don't have coffee shops everywhere like we did in New Jersey, but we have to eat simpler foods. Sometimes we eat out of our own gardens, our own farm foods. It's not as good to eat taste-wise, but it's healthy and it's simple and it's peaceful. So you've got to weigh the pros and the cons. The city mouse thinks that his place is cool because he gets to have some delicious food, but he's got to run for his life and hide in a hole when people come into the room. The country mouse doesn't want to live like that. The country mouse would rather be safe and have some peas and bacon and keep it simple. And I know you might be thinking bacon sounds pretty good to me, but the point is it's simple country food. It's not all the fancy stuff that you have in a town or in a city. So the moral of that fable, this fable on the country mouse and the town mouse, is that we always have to weigh the good and the bad when we decide to do things, right? Just because someone says, oh, if you come here, there's this good thing. Yeah, but what's the cost of that good thing, right? I really don't want to have to run for my life every 10 minutes in order to have some fancy food. I would rather be safe and have some simple food, right? So we can see the moral of that story. St. Paul the Apostle in the New Testament, he talks about this same idea. He tells us that we, as Christians, we should be content with food and clothing. He says, be content with food and clothing. And you say, what? What about all this stuff I want? I want a bike. I want, fancy shoes. I want a violin. What about all this stuff? And you can think about what St. Paul is trying to say when he says, be content with food and clothing. He's telling us to be careful to weigh the costs of different things, right? Simplicity of life. If you think of the saints, think of St. Francis. He didn't even have shoes. He walked around barefoot. and lived like a poor. Why would he do that? Why would the saints do things like that? Right? When Saint Ignatius of Loyola had his conversion experience, he chose to leave a wealthy life living in the city, and he went and lived in a cave. Why would he do that? Why would the saints do these crazy things? It's because of this lesson here in this story, that you've got to consider the good things, because they often come with bad things, right? And sometimes it's better to have less so that you don't have to deal with all the bad stuff. It may be better to live in a quiet, boring place where you don't have the dangers or distractions of something else. Or if someone offers you some good thing, you have to think carefully about the cost of it. And we can give lots of examples like that. And I think you understand that. You know, when you're a kid, you say, what kind of car would you like to have when you grow up? And you say, oh, I want a Ferrari. You know, I want to talk about all, but you don't think about what it costs to have that car, what it costs to maintain that car, you know, the fact that people want to steal that car. There's all of these other problems that come with it. It's not just having the car, it's also having to take care of it, having to pay $2,000 just to change the oil and things like that. So there's lots of negatives and costs to think about when we desire things. So that's the moral lesson of the fable of the country mouse and the city mouse. Is that clear? Does everybody understand that? You can give me a yes and no. If there's any questions about that fable or the other fable before we wrap up today? Any questions? Should we submit this? Yeah, you can do this and submit that as well. That's fine. No questions, no questions. Well, if you have no questions, we're all done here. Remember one announcement from the beginning of the talk. I'm going to offer a bunch of different live classes. I haven't set the schedule yet for when they'll be, but if you'd like to participate in them, talk to your parents about it. Make sure your parents understand that they don't need to pay anything extra for these classes. So if they would like you to participate in them, you're invited to do so. Okay, I'll figure out when the days and times are, and all of these classes will be recorded. So if you can't make a certain class, you can still watch the video and see what we talked about. All right. So that's it. We're done with this live class for today. I'll hang out for a little while if anybody has any questions on chat, but the rest of you are free to go. God bless you all. Yes, I'm making a Greek reading class. So yeah, there will be a Greek reading class, Greek reading, Latin reading, English composition and grammar. There'll be a history and geography class. There'll be Aesop's fables, and we'll also add Theophrastus and Pliny to this class. There will also be a philosophy class for older students, catechism and Catholic Bible class. So a bunch of classes. I sent an email to your parents. You can just tell them that there might be an email waiting for them and they can check it out. Okay. So that's it. We're all set for today. Hope that was helpful. And if you got any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. If not, you can fly away and have a good day. All right. Take care, everybody.